this is Matt Lucy, your host here on Dairy Digressions, the podcast of the American Dairy Science Association that features the latest science from the Journal of Dairy Science and JDS Communications and takes you behind the scenes with the top minds in dairy. Today, I'm coming to you with a special bonus episode of the pod recorded live at the 2024 Annual Meeting in West Palm Beach, Florida. As many of you know, the H5N1 strain of avian influenza or bird flu has recently spilled over to dairy cows and workers, raising critical questions about the impacts on cow health, worker safety, dairy products, and consumer trust. So ADSA, committed to keeping you informed, added a two-part late-breaking hot topic panel to the annual meeting program entitled H5N1 Bird Flu Outbreak and Its Impact on Dairy. We know many of our listeners couldn't make it to the meeting, so we recorded it to ensure that you got a front row seat to hear answers to your most pressing questions about the H5N1 outbreak. Unlike our usual episodes, I'll be turning over the mic to Jess McArt, Editor-in-Chief of JDS Communications, who did a great job moderating the discussion between some of the leading voices in animal health and food safety, including Pamela Ruegg and Nicole Martin. I'll ask you to please forgive the audio quality of today's episode. This panel was standing room only, so we did our best to remove the crowd noise. It's important to remember that this is an evolving situation. Much of the information we have now is based on personal observations and has not yet been tested in controlled research trials. However, the ADSA meeting provides a perfect platform for us as a community to share this kind of emerging science and discuss its implications in a safe and collaborative environment. And of course, we want to hear from you. As the situation unfolds, we'll continue to provide updates and insights from experts. So send your questions to adsa@adsa.org, and we'll do our best to get you the answers you need. Be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on so you never miss an update. Now let's dive into the panel.
I'm Jess McArt. I'm an associate professor at Cornell University, and I'm the editor-in-chief of JDS Communications. What we're going to do for running the panel, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to start with a question each. So we'll get started now. First, we have Dr. Pam Ruegg. Dr. Ruegg holds the Davis J. Ellis Chair in Antimicrobial Resistance and Large Animal Clinical Sciences in the College of Veterinary Medicine at Michigan State University. She's focused on research and outreach to help improve animal health and farm sustainability. We then have Dr. Nicole Martin. Dr. Martin is an assistant research professor in dairy food microbiology and the associate director of the Milk Quality Improvement Program in the Department of Food Science at Cornell University. And Nicole and I have an argument going on about who makes the best chocolate milk. So that may be our next panel next year. Dr. Martin conducts farm-to-consumer dairy microbiology research and works closely with dairy industry stakeholders, including producers and processors. So I'm going to start off, Pam, with a question for you, and if you don't mind describing the status of the H5N1 outbreak in dairy cattle in Michigan.
Yeah, so we are, unfortunately, the state that has the most affected herds, at least that have been confirmed. In Michigan, we have 25 confirmed herds. That means that these herds have submitted samples from at least one cow for PCR testing at a certified veterinary diagnostic lab. And of those 25 herds, they're distributed in 10 counties. The 10 counties are clustered together in the middle and west of our state. They're not randomly distributed. We also have had 6.5 million chickens and poultry that have been sacrificed, and those birds are located in the same approximate counties as the cattle. The animals in the herd were detected a couple months ago. The first herd was affected directly by shipment of an affected animal from Texas. So this was an animal that came from the Texas affected herds, which were the first herds affected. It was clinically normal in the herd when it arrived, and then it spread to the rest of the herd, and that was our kind of sentinel herd in the state.
Nicole, this one's for you. How long is H5N1 stable in milk, and is pasteurization effective at inactivating the virus?
So there have been a few groups who have looked at stability of this particular strain in raw milk at various temperatures, and it does appear to be quite stable. I've seen data from a couple of groups, and it appears to still be infectious at weeks after the sample was taken, so extremely stable at refrigeration temperatures, so 4 degrees Celsius. At higher temperatures, it declines more rapidly, but obviously the fact that it is fairly stable at low temperatures is concerning because those are the temperatures that we maintain milk at in the supply chain for the dairy industry. Again, a couple of studies have come out both with this specific strain as well as similar strains that are not infecting cattle right now on the efficacy of pasteurization, both high temperature short time pasteurization, which as you know is the most common type of pasteurization that we use in the United States for fluid milk, as well as batch or vat pasteurization, which is 63 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes. And we do see fairly large declines in infectious dose after pasteurization, both temperatures. Studies are varying though on what that log reduction is in the viral load. I've seen 5 log up to about 6.5 log, and those of us who we're sort of looking at the literature on H5N1 inactivation in egg pasteurization. Frankly, we're expecting a higher reduction simply because of the compositional differences in eggs versus fluid milk. And so the things that we're looking at, though, are obviously the initial dose or viral load of the milk is very high. So that's one factor. And then also, I mentioned the compositional differences. So we know in the milk from clinically affected cows, the composition of that milk is quite different visually. I don't know, Pam might know better than I if anybody has actually measured the composition of that milk or not. But that also affects heat transfer, right? So when you have higher total solid content, that reduces your heat transfer effectiveness, and so that can impact the overall heat treatment effectiveness for viral inactivation.
All right, I'm going to go to slide of questions. This one's by far our most popular. And Pam, I'm going to throw this one at you. Do you see federal or state governments requiring testing on dairies? As we have folks that suspect that dairies might be positive but may not want to test because of other implications.
I have no way to answer that, whether or not there be federal regulation or state regulation. Right now, there are no regulations relative to testing. If you do test, it is a reportable disease. The disease is then reportable. There are herds that are not testing because they know what the clinical signs look like. But right now, that's a really hot political topic. And I think that it would be a big step to mandate required testing at this time, and it'd be hard to enforce.
Great. That's another question that comes here that I think you just answered is, should bulk tank testing be mandatory?
Yeah, the bulk tank testing mandatory thing, I'm not even going to attempt to answer. That is a really, really hot political item. I think, there's great concerns that we maintain the integrity and the trust of the consumers in the milk so far, and Nicole knows more on this than I do. So far, we feel like we are with what we're seeing. I would say I just saw a very, very recent study. They did a mathematical calculation on how many herds would have to be affected to actually impact productivity and stuff in the U.S., and it would be an enormous number of herds. So I think the thing that we really want to look at is stopping the spread of this disease, and I personally think that some of the movement restrictions have been at least somewhat effective in doing that, because the spread between states has been less fast than many of us have expected.
Great. So this question's for whoever wants to take it, but is milk the only product of dairy production that we should be concerned about? Are there any concerns with semen, embryos, other methods for transmitting this virus, mechanical, people on farm?
I'll take that on that part. Within the last few days, the initial USDA dollars that came into Michigan to look kind of at the epidemiology of how is this spread among farms, they've released some preliminary results of this, and there's been a lot of testing going on the initial farms. The virus is not thought at this time to being spread by wild birds or migratory birds. It came in with infected cattle, and the transmission between farms, they believe at this point, is a result of the same things that other diseases transmit between farms. Shared people, workers going between farms, they know for sure that's happened between the dairy and the poultry farms. There were people working on dairy farms that were also working on poultry farms, or living with people working on poultry farms. That's a route of transmission. There's a lot of work being done looking at milk trucks and the rendering trucks, the dead stock trucks, the boots of people. So right now, the emphasis is on reducing movement, increasing biosecurity, being cleaner, and limiting the number of people to farms, to people that are essential to come to the farms, and also reducing movement of farm workers between different farms and between poultry and dairy.
Nicole, throw this one at you. If H5N1 is here to stay as an industry, do you think that we can handle consumer perception?
So consumer perception is obviously a big risk for us, right? We're just coming off of COVID. This is another virus that's being spread. There's a lot of press running around about this issue, right? So I think that is a concern that we have to be careful about. And I think being, transparent and being cautious about making overtly confident statements at this point, doing the science and having that back up what we expect to be happening, which is that, pasteurization is an effective tool to reduce this virus, that the pasteurized milk supply in the United States is safe. And then I would kind of go on a tangent a little bit about that, right? Because not all of our products in the United States are pasteurized. And so I think from a consumer perception standpoint, a lot of consumers are probably not going to see the difference if someone gets ill from consuming a raw milk product versus a pasteurized milk product. That's still going to have an impact on consumer perception of the safety of our system. So that's a big concern for us. And obviously, there are a number of groups working toward developing the science on the food side, because the more exposures we have, we all know, the higher risk that virus doesn't just jump from dairy cattle into humans, but jumps from human to human. And obviously, that's sort of worst case scenario. And I think really puts the point on, is this virus here to stay? And I'm not an epidemiologist, but that's certainly the concern that I would bring up.
We have a lot of animal health and production questions, Pam, so we're getting another one here. There's a lot of information out there that suggests that young stock may not be as affected clinically. Our thoughts, is this true? Yes, why or why not? What does that look like?
So to a lot of these questions, I'm probably going to answer, we don't really know for sure on a lot of these questions. I'm going to give you anecdotal evidence, and from talking to veterinarians who directly treating animals on farms. I'm going to tell you, I also work with nutritionists who are working with herds during outbreaks and managing the nutrition. And I've talked to a number of farmers who are affected, and they've shared information. But I haven't we don't have a lot of data yet to say this is definitively correct. So in everything I say, I want a disclaimer on. This is today, okay, when we're talking about this. I can tell you every single week for about the last 8 weeks, I've learned more about this particular outbreak. So relative to calves, there are some farmers who believe their calves have been ill. They don't think they're very ill. In fact, a lot of farmers don't think most of their cattle are very ill. So what I've been heard described on the calves is, they're kind of like, a kid with the flu. They've seen some decreased intakes. They've seen some more lethargic calves, and during an outbreak where they've confirmed that they've had the disease on the farm. So I believe it's probably likely that there may be some calves affected, but we don't know for sure yet.
And this goes to both on-farm workers and processors, but what kind of PPE should we be recommending for both on-farm personnel dealing with cows or processing milk?
I can answer that question as well. The CDC has recommendations of what sort of PPE should be used, and I recommend we follow the recommendations of public health authorities. But I'll also make a couple comments relative to why maybe people aren't, because people aren't following those recommendations on the farms. And one of the reasons is people that are working in the milking parlors and the people that are working treating the sick animals during an outbreak are working really hard, and they're tired, and it's hot, and it's hard to implement a lot of this stuff when they don't perceive an enormous risk to themselves. So I think a couple of things to think about. There have been 3 confirmed cases that I'm aware of in humans in the U.S., 1 in Texas and 2 in Michigan. 2 of those cases have been ocular infections where they have conjunctivitis. I don't know the route of transmission of those, but I'll tell you, when I work in a milking parlor, I always get milk splashed in my eyes. And we know there's tons of viruses in the eyes. So I think personally, this is my opinion, a minimum level of protection for people who are going to be exposed to milk should be glasses, okay? Safety glasses. I think the CDC is recommending face shields. I think people who've tried face shields have not adopted them very long. So I think we got to work with people where they're at in their jobs. And, you know, for the people working in milking parlors that aren't doing anything, any kind of eye protection is better than nothing. The other worker in the United States, one that got or in Michigan, that got a lot of press was the worker who had a respiratory infection. That worker, my understanding is, and I'm fairly confident on this, that worker was directly involved with treatments of sick animals. Now, the treatments for this disease are supportive therapies, and the animals run high fevers, generally, the clinically affected ones, and the treatments are usually aspirin boluses and oral rehydration. I'm a veterinarian. I've done those treatments myself. When you are giving oral treatments to large cattle, your head is right next to their nostrils. And so if we've got any sort of respiratory transmission risk, which has not yet been confirmed, but if we do, I think personally, if I was doing those treatments, I would be wearing a mask while I was doing the treatments. So I think, you know, that we should be following the CDC guidelines, but if your people won't do that, during an outbreak on the farm, we should really be stressing, you know, eye protection, mask protection, wearing gloves, so that you can, you know, easily remove any milk contamination.
This is kind of a 2-part question for Nicole and Pam. And Nicole, we spoke about this yesterday and the day before. If you could start by discussing the study that looked at milk samples prior to clinical disease. And then Pam, if you could just do a high-level overview of the clinical presentation of animals affected.
Fortuitously, one of the affected farms that ended up testing positive had been taking milk samples and saving those for about a month prior to the point where they had a clinically affected animal that tested positive. And so they were able to go back and test those milk tank samples that they had saved. And they were able to identify that the virus showed up about 16 days prior to any clinical signs of infection in that herd. So I think, you know, that's one of the pieces of this outbreak and the risk of spread and infection that's really important for us to understand is how long is that virus present there prior to us being able to really see it in the animals themselves.
So the clinical signs of the disease, it's actually kind of an interesting scenario. The signs are nonspecific to a certain extent. And what you'll typically see is in your lactating herd, you'll see a bunch of animals with high fevers. And these fevers in the most severely affected animals are really high. I didn't believe it when people first started telling me what they were. They're like 107, 108 degrees in the worst affected animals. And so you'll have high fevers. You'll have a dramatic drop in milk production. The milk looks abnormal. Okay, more cholesterol-like than milk-like. And that'll occur somewhere in about 10 to 15% of the animals. And, you know, the initial reports came out and people said, well, it's only in mature animals in late lactation. That's not true at all. It happens in every stage of lactation across the herd. It happens in first lactation animals. It happens in fresh animals. But you do tend to see more clinically affected animals that are older. It's pretty interesting. I've talked to 3 farmers who have some type of precision dairy technology on their farms. And these farms have their alerts. It could be rumination, it could be feed intake, it could be temperatures. Often the first thing they see is the alerts double or triple. So you're going along at a steady level and they get these alerts go off, which they come and they look at their alert list and they're like, wow, what's going on? There's a lot of subclinically affected animals. out there, apparently. And I talked to one particular veterinarian who worked with many animals on a farm that he works with. He said he was walking through the barn in a group where they had quite a few affected animals, 10 to 15%. He decided to stick thermometers in healthy-looking animals, animals that were up and eating. He said every animal he tested in that pen, even the ones that appeared healthy, their temperatures were higher than expected. They were like 103, 103 and a half, 104. The other thing that happens universally in farms, and this is terrible, but about a week to 2 weeks, kind of going along with the bug tank, on farms that have cats, all the cats die. And so many farmers, if they find dead cats, that's better than a PCR test. If you've got dead cats in high fevers in your animals, that's something people are looking at on a very practical basis as an indication of the disease.
Nicole, this one is for you. And it is, what is your favorite chocolate milk and why is it worse than McNamara Dairies from Plainfield, New Hampshire?
New York State chocolate milk. I don't know what I have to do to convert you.
Good.
Ridiculous.
We're going to have a panel where you can all try it next year. How about we do that?
Tasty.
Nicole, this question is for you. And folks are interested in what do we know about humans ingesting raw milk and raw cheese?
Nothing. But that being said, right, we have some preliminary evidence that would suggest that we should exercise some caution around this topic, right, because of, one, the high titers in raw milk from infected animals. We know that these raw milk products have exceptionally high viral loads, right? We know that the consumption of this infected raw milk is associated with deaths in farm cats. There have been some trials with ferrets. I think we have to be careful because there's nuance here, right? Do I think that the milk going into the general milk supply is likely to have this unique combination where we have these really high viral loads and people are consuming that? No, I think that's fairly low risk. And in general, I think the food safety risk is low, but we can have the conversation about if folks are drinking raw milk with these high viral loads, that certainly presents a risk that, we should be concerned about. There's enough evidence to be concerned about that. And again, I don't think that there's any reason to believe that this is a gastrointestinal transmission route. Likely what's happening is when you consume any food product, there's orthonasal exposure to whatever you're consuming. And I think that if that's the transmission route, then that's most likely, right? So exercise caution. We know very little for sure at this point.
Perfect. Thank you. Pam, I'll throw this one to you. I know that you're a veterinarian and as a USDA accredited veterinarian, what is your take on if you are at a dairy and you see cows that you suspect may have H5N1, ethically and legally, do you need to test and how does that work?
Within our state Department of Agriculture has declared an extraordinary emergency. And in our state, veterinarians are supposed to be testing suspect animals and in an accredited laboratory. And all positive tests, these are PCR tests, are required to be reported. So it's a reportable disease if the test is done. So one of the biggest concerns is we can't really fully control the disease unless we know who has it. So I think it's very important that people comply with trying to identify infected herds. However, there's a real practical, ethical dilemma there, because if the producer does not want to have their herd tested, they're probably not going to call the vet. They don't have to call the vet. So there's a really fine line there, I think, in maintaining veterinary oversight of herds and following the regulations. And that's between the individual veterinarian and their clients and personal ethics of those people. Legally, the veterinarians are supposed to report it.
This is a poultry question, so if nobody wants to handle it, I understand that I don't like to do chickens either. But if dairies continue to choose not to test and poultry in the area are affected, are there any legal actions that can be taken?
I have no idea. I mean, this is the United States, and there can be a legal action taken on virtually anything. So I would assume the answer is yes. But I'd also say in our initial outbreak in Michigan, and there's approximately 99 or 100 herds that are confirmed through PCR testing, official testing in the United States to be positive for this. And of those, there's 25 of those have been confirmed in Michigan. We also have a number of poultry farms which were confirmed at the same time, and a USDA task force, strike force, came in late March, early April, and has done a lot of testing throughout the state and issued their final report last week. And they were looking at potential routes of transmission to both poultry and to the dairy farms. About 2/3 of the dairy farms were likely infected by movement of cattle between farms. About a third, maybe a quarter to a third of the herds were closed herds, confirmed closed herds. And the poultry farms got infected with the H5N1 Texas ancestry strain. Okay, so this is the strain. It came to Michigan in subclinically infected cattle that were asymptomatic and remained asymptomatic for about 7 to 10 days on the farm before it broke. And then soon after that, we had a large poultry operation that broke. And there was a lot of concern on how this happened because the poultry operations in Michigan have been buttoned down hard because of the migratory avian influenza, which they had 2 years ago. And so they got huge biosecurity. Well, what they've determined with this Texas ancestry strain is that the most likely route of transmission was employees who worked on dairy farms and maybe also worked on poultry farms. So that's been confirmed. And also there were employees who were partners of maybe one of the partners, like the wife worked on a dairy farm and the husband worked on the poultry farm, and this was unknown. And so a huge risk factor that was identified in this analysis is working amongst either multiple farms or multiple industries. So what I think, if you're looking at the poultry farms, our poultry industry, our major employer in our area, laid off 400 people about a week ago. I'm pretty sure, that most of the people who had shared employment between dairies and poultry farms no longer have employment, at least on the poultry farms. So I think when we look at the poultry issue, more biosecurity and a very strict barrier away from contact with people who are working on infected farms.
Thank you. If you can comment on if we know anything about animal-to-animal transmission and if we know anything about immunity post-infection and how long that might last.
Right, those are two really different questions. I'm going to answer the second one first. I'm also going to say 2 months ago I knew nothing about this subject, like nothing. So I'm not an expert really, but I have learned a little bit over the last couple of months. I saw some really interesting data out of some of the original animals that were tested I believe they were out of Texas, and I believe the testing was done in Iowa, where they went in and they took milk samples and they tested for viral load. So you're looking at the PCR levels, and these animals, when they detect them with clinical signs, they have tons of virus in the milk. So the CT thresholds are like 5, they're very, very low. And then in this group, I think it was 28 or 30 animals, they tested them weekly for about, 4 to 6 weeks. And those CT thresholds went up and up and up until about 4 to 6 weeks out there, almost all of the animals are negative. And I think that threshold is 38 or 39, somewhere in that area. They didn't stay positive for a real long time. They also presented some data from a subset of those animals where they were doing ELISA testing on blood, looking at antibodies, and the antibodies went up dramatically in these animals over the same period. So it appears that dairy cattle are effectively mounting an immune response. And, most of the animals don't get very sick. So, it's only 10 to 20% of the animals where you get animals with really obvious clinical signs, but probably most of the animals are subclinically infected, or a lot of them are, or you'll have a lot of animals with kind of low fevers. So, yes, it appears they do mount an antibody response. And it appears that the amount of shedding of the virus overall drops pretty dramatically. Although I will say, I have talked to veterinarians and who are continuing to testing animals on farms, and there are animals that remain positive on PCR tests for quite a long time. So there is individual animal variation. And I think the testing that people are requiring for expedition, for movement, that's money well spent. The first part of that question was
Cow-to-cow transmission.
cow-to-cow transmission. That is a great question. We don't know fully the answer to that. So there's a lot of people in the field. We know there's a lot of virus in the milk. And we know that animals get infected. If you bring in an animal, it appears the clinical syndrome at the herd level is you bring in an infected animal, subclinical, nothing happens for a little while, incubation period. You find some dead cats, and you're like, oh no, I got dead cats. And then the next day, you've got a whole bunch of animals with really high fevers, and your milk yield drops, and you got all the clinical signs that go with it. That kind of goes along with what we're seeing in animals. But we don't really know how that transmission among animals happened. There's a lot of conjecture. People are like, well, it's probably in the milking parlor from cow to cow to cow because there's so much virus in that milk. We have no idea if that really works. And then there's some thought that there's respiratory transmission, but nobody has confirmed that yet. So, I want to remind everybody, we're really early in this. I'm a person who likes to speak from data, and I'm sitting in front of a whole group of people not speaking from data hardly at all. So I think we have to be very cautious, but can it likely be transmitted in respiratory fashion? I think it's probably likely. It's an influenza virus. So, I think we've got to think about minimizing contact, minimizing airspace of infected animals, as well as minimizing contact with milk.
Nicole, this one's for you. So, any thoughts on the virus showing up in wastewater that's not associated with positive dairies? So, are there processing facilities that may be getting milk from areas of the country where that state is not positive, where we may be bringing positive milk in? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm certainly not an expert on wastewater, so if either of my colleagues here want to talk about that, but I will talk about at the processing level, it's a step removed from any ability to determine any clues as to whether there's an infection there, right? When we're on the farm, we can look for clinical signs, we can look for dead cats, we have some markers that help us to evaluate what could be going on. At the processing side, it's a barrier there. We're getting in milk in tanker trucks, we have no ability to say, okay, maybe there's something going on or not. So there's another level of uncertainty that shows up there, and I think that right now what we're encouraging folks to do is keep an eye on infections in your area, although we all know that milk moves across state lines. We get milk in from Pennsylvania, we get milk, New York milk goes into other states. So that's not a completely foolproof method, but there has to be an awareness at that level because we don't have the ability to keep an eye on symptoms or keep an eye on the herd at the processing level. So I think it's a good question that is kind of an evolving, we talked about PPE yesterday. Certainly I don't think we need to be, getting everybody in Tyvek suits at the processing level, but we do have to keep an eye on what's happening in our area and in our milk shed from a processing perspective.
While I have you on the processing side, we had talked about this a little earlier in the week, but we feed a lot of whey to cows. Any thoughts on, Pam just talked about the high viral load. What might be implications or what things should we look for?
Sure. So it depends on how we generate that whey. Some whey is generated without a heat treatment and some whey is generated with a heat treatment. And at this point, we're pretty encouraged about the impact that heat treatment has on viral infectivity. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other is a lot of whey is generated from cheese making, and a lot of times we have acidification when we make cheese. And there's also a reason to believe that likely has an impact on infectivity, but we, don't have the data to support that yet. Those are experiments that we're beginning at Cornell to work on answering. But, obviously, if we're in a situation where we're not heat treating the whey, it's not acidified, and we have those whey streams, and they're going back to cows, we don't yet know what kind of separation into the protein fraction and the weight fraction there is on this virus yet. So that's another factor. But you could imagine a scenario where there is a high viral load in a whey product that's being fed back to animals. And so, that would be a concern to me. Certainly the amount that they're consuming would play a role as well. Viral load, consumption amount, susceptibility of the animal to it. A lot of those things we don't know yet, but those are all factors that need to be considered.
All right, Pam, I know the answer to this one, but I'm going to ask you because you're probably know more than I do. Can you explain the tropism of the virus to the udder? Why are we seeing it so much?
So this is a great question. It's actually really a cool thing. If this was an abstract concept, I would find this fascinating. So the receptor cells are these sialic acid receptors. And in dairy cattle, they're in the udder. And we don't know why. Maybe there's somebody in here who does, but they don't really know why. In cats, they're in the neurologic tissue. I think in humans, they're in the respiratory tract. But the reason we get so much virus in the mammary gland is they've got the right cell receptors there. The reason cats die is because they've got these receptors in their neurologic tissue. So that's why we're finding the virus where we find it.
The next question is, how do we think this virus could affect state and county fairs? We're starting show season. I will say that we just got an email from New York State today to USDA accredited vets that all cows in New York will need to have a milk test within 7 days of transfer to a show. And those tests have to be done at certain accredited labs. So the logistics of that might be difficult, but at least for New York State, that's a requirement for New York State shows. But Pam, what do you know about?
So they're all exhibitions with lactating dairy cattle and poultry are canceled in Michigan. There'll be none this year.
There may be none in New York State too. Nicole, what are we concerned or anticipating from consumers, and how can we be proactive on informing the public and answering questions that they have?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question, and I don't do consumer research, and I'm really grateful for the people who do because I don't understand them. But consumers are really driven by a few things, and fear is one of them. And so obviously we're concerned about public perception because this is a potentially really, frightening event. I think that the more we can rapidly do the science, the more we get ahead of the what ifs. And we've already seen a lot of what ifs, right? And I think that's why it's so important that there is a network of individuals, academic institutions, government institutions, industry coming together to answer some of these questions so that we can get facts out there. Because that's what's going to inform the best response to this is data. As Pam said, we are working on very little data. It is being generated, but I think the more we can get that information, factual information out there, the more we can assuage fears from consumers.
Thank you for that. One last question, Pam. We now have some people who are very concerned that World Dairy Expo is going to be canceled. Do you know anything about that?
I do not know if World Dairy Expo will be canceled. I think that would be I think that would be an extreme measure. And my guess is, I believe Wisconsin is requiring testing for animals now, just started that. And there's probably going to be some testing requirement, which is a good idea at this point.
Great. All right, well, it's 5 o'clock, and appreciate you all coming. If you have any questions, we'll be around. Thank you.
All right, everybody, that brings us to the end of this special live episode of Dairy Digressions. What questions about H5N1 outbreak does this discussion raise for you? Do you have topics you'd like to see us tackle here on the pod? Let us know at adsa@adsa.org. And again, we hope to be back soon with more as the science around this episode develops. We also hope to see you at next year's ADSA Annual Meeting happening June 22nd to 25th in Louisville, Kentucky. This has been Matt Lucy, your host, and until next time, stay safe and enjoy your science.